Centers. Now, I should say our report, it's actually that of my colleague, Neetu Arnold. She will be presenting about the report she has just written, which is about the politicization and capture of various Middle East studies centers. We will then be having comments from two distinguished scholars, Martin Kramer, Walter P. Stern Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Winfield Myers, Director of Academic Affairs for the Middle East Forum. Now, I believe we'll be providing some of their many publications in the chat button or Q&A button below, which ought to have stuff like links to the Amazon pages. Please go and buy their collected works at once, if not yesterday. It's certainly worth doing. Now, a quick bit on the format. My colleague, Neetu Arnold, speaks, then Dr. Kramer, then Dr. Myers. We then open up to question and answers. This is ideally provided by you, the audience, in either the chat or the Q&A buttons at the bottom of this panel. So please put them in. I convey them, or the panelists can read down and look and answer on their own. They can also just talk and converse with one another. It's meant to be a good conversation. If your questions don't get answered, and I don't do them chronologically, I just do them in whatever order seems like a good conversation, don't worry. Send me email, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I will be delighted to forward your questions to the panelists so they can have the opportunity to respond to you. I should also say, if you have to leave early, we record this. Within 24 hours, the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel will have this recording up and available for perpetuity. So you can watch it, you can send the link to your friends. I'll just stop there. Neetu, would you care to start with your presentation on Hijacked?
Yes, thank you for introducing us, David, and I appreciate everybody who will be watching this either live or in the future. This is a very important topic, and I'm happy to be presenting our new report, Hijacked, the capture of America's Middle East studies. I'm also honored to be joined by Wynn and Martin, who have done extensive work on this important subject. So I'm going to start by saying that Middle East centers have received interest and scrutiny for quite some time. In the 1970s, there were concerns of Saudi influence at Georgetown's Arab Studies Center, which later prompted stricter foreign funding requirement laws. Some have even criticized the ideological distortions of the center, which have heavily been influenced by Edward Said's Orientalism. Many have also noted the anti-Israel bias present at these centers. That was one of the concerns that actually sparked an investigation into UNC Chapel Hill's program back in 2019 after they brought an anti-Semitic rapper. So Hijacked addresses the issues I've just mentioned, but we also tried to build on previous works by the people who have researched this issue. We do mention that, or we do look into how universities with these centers have failed to disclose foreign funds, and we've documented instances of anti-Israel bias. But we've also found, and this is really important, that these centers have been captured by activist faculty members. And so at this point in the 2020s, many of the problems with the discipline, with the centers, are within. Our report provides 7 in-depth case studies of universities with either a Middle East Studies or Islamic Studies center. And for the purposes of this presentation and in the report, I refer to them as Middle East Studies centers. It's easier to refer to them with just one term. So we provide case studies on centers at Harvard University, Georgetown University, George Mason University, the University of Arkansas, the North Carolina Consortium, which consists of departments at Duke University and the University of North Carolina, University of Texas at Austin, and Yale University. These case studies rely on information from archived materials, interviews with university officials and faculty and students, funding data that we got from the Department of Education, and university course syllabus. I also made a couple of trips to these centers to see what was happening on the grounds. And so that will be reflected in the case studies. So through our case studies, you will find instances of bias, undisclosed foreign funds, and some questionable decisions made by the universities over the years. And so I want to highlight some of our findings. And I want to preface this by saying these are only a few. There's a lot more. So I'll first start off by saying that at the University of Arkansas's King Fahd Center, which was founded through a major Saudi gift back in the 1990s, the King Fahd Center currently provides financial support for a poetry contest where the winner must be of Arab heritage, which is problematic because that seems discriminatory and unlawful. At George Mason University, we found that they failed to disclose their original funds to start the center back in 2009 from Turkey. And they claimed that they didn't have to report the $3 million because it went to the University Foundation, which is separate. It's a separate organization from the university itself, even though George Mason is the primary beneficiary of this foundation. And finally, Georgetown's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, which is a federally funded national resource center, includes foreign government officials on their advisory board. Just to give some background on national resource centers, they were originally created to promote American national security, and these centers would help train experts in area studies, in languages. But I think what's problematic here with Georgetown, with foreign government officials on an advisory board is they are bringing their own interests and their own interests for their countries rather than what is best for America. So these are only just a few of the findings, and you will find a lot more information in the report. Maybe we will even get to discuss it in the Q&A. So one thing that the case studies provide is what's happening on the ground, but oftentimes this is individual to each university, and we may not be able to make broad claims so easily. So another contribution from our report is we provide data analysis. And what's really cool about this is that we were able to use 20 years worth of Department of Education data, this data for national resource centers. So this information contains the kind of outreach that these centers conduct, the instructional materials that they produce, who are they targeting these events to? Are they for government officials? Are they for K through 12 teachers? Are they for higher education students or higher education audience? So this was information that was quite illuminating, and I also want to share a couple of the findings there. And what's nice about this data analysis is that we can actually make some broader conclusions, some broader generalizations about national resource centers. So I actually want to take a moment to share my screen here to provide some information. So, okay. See. I hope all of you can see this here. So this is the coverage of we looked at different topics that were covered at these centers, and this is specifically looking at their outreach material. So we looked at issues such as immigration, their coverage of the Israel-Palestine issue, feminism, climate change, and so forth. So I wanted to provide an example here where we look at their coverage of immigration at all Middle Eastern National Resource Centers over time. And so as you can see from this graph, so the yellow line is supposed to be the trend line. So is it a positive or negative trend? And then the purple line reflects the actual coverage of the outreach materials, and we use the titles. So as you can see, there's been an increase in coverage of immigration related topics, and we see a major spike in 2015 where the coverage is above 4%, which tells us that that was a major issue that these centers were interested in focusing on. And specifically around this time, that was the Syrian refugee crisis. So that's where they're referring, the centers are responding to current events, and immigration is one of those issues that's become more important over time. I mean, in the 2016 election, that was a major issue, even in the United States. But oftentimes what we see when these centers cover immigration issues, it's not so much from the perspective of American national security or about how we can secure our borders. It's more about how things like Islamophobia or xenophobia is affecting immigration policies and how it affects refugees or other people who might want to come into the country. So something else we also decided to look into was the coverage of the Israel and Palestine issue, because for many people, the reason to their reason and their interest for Middle East Studies Centers is this Israel-Palestine issue. It's been a contentious issue even before the 2000s. And I found this information quite interesting, because it used to be that in the 2000s, there was significant coverage of the Israel-Palestine issue at 10%, but over time, it dipped to around 4%. Now, this is still, so I'm not saying that Israel and Palestine is not an issue that's covered at the universities. 4% is still relatively a lot compared to some of the other topics we looked into. But over time, they've decreased their focus on this issue, which means they had to increase coverage on other issues, such as immigration, refugee issues. And there are a couple of reasons for why this decrease could have happened. First, in general, the Israel-Palestine issue, even in the media, their coverage has decreased over time. So there's some parallels between what the centers are focusing on and the media. But another explanation that could explain this decrease is that there was quite a bit of scrutiny for their coverage of the Israel-Palestine issue in the 2000s, even prior to that they were biased. And this scrutiny could have affected their coverage. They basically did not feel confident enough to cover it anymore. Maybe they tried to avoid it because they could get more scrutiny and they just wanted to avoid that. So I think that tells us that holding these centers accountable and keeping an eye on what they're covering does make a difference. So I'm going to exit out of this screen here. So those are just a few of the kind of data analysis that we do in the report and that you can read, especially it's in the Middle East trends section. So again, this is just a sample, and there are many questions that we explore. And really, I think what the data does is it allows us to make broader generalizations, and the case studies allow us to see what's actually happening on the grounds, and it provides context to the data. So really, there were a couple of takeaways from this report that I would like to share. You know, the first is that the center in the field of Middle East studies have exhibited a mission drift. And this is particularly noticeable at the National Resource Centers, which are supposed to focus on language acquisition and cultural knowledge relevant to national security. But as I document in the report, there's a lot more emphasis on ideas of lived experience, which can bias the results. It may not provide useful information related to national security. There's actually one course at UT Austin, which relied on the lived experience of a Palestinian professor. And he referred to the Arab-Israeli wars as the Nakba, which is a emotive and divisive term. And so we may not be getting an accurate picture of exactly what's going on with the history and with the events. So this is just an example of some of the mission drift and distortions that are happening. The second issue that we found was that there's an issue of transparency. Again, I looked into the University of Arkansas in George Mason specifically, where officials at those centers both said that they didn't have to report certain foreign funds because it went to the university foundation, which is a bit of a ridiculous explanation because the main beneficiaries are the universities. The foundations they're not all that different from the universities. If those funds are meant to benefit the university or the centers at the universities, they should be available upon when somebody files a public information request. So that was a second issue. And then their third, it's just ideological issues. The centers focus on pro-Muslim subjectivism. There's more concern about presenting a positive perception of Muslims or Islam rather than just presenting the truth, regardless of whether the perception is negative or positive. And there's also been a push for divisive topics such as critical race theory. Again, going back to University of Texas, there's their Middle East Center, which when I was studying this report, it was a national resource center. They contributed 10 instructional materials to a critical theory workshop for elementary school teachers. One of the instructional materials included, quote, starting and sustaining critical race literacy in the classroom, which this is not really about bettering students' literacy skills. This is about promoting racism essentially and promoting a racial lens. So these are just a few of the things that we document in the report, and we have a couple of solutions that we suggest. There's 6 total. I will present a couple of them for this webinar. So first, we would recommend ending federal funds to national resource centers. This is not just for Middle East centers, but for all of them. They have been infected with divisive ideologies and distortions, and taxpayers should not be on the hook to fund these centers. I would also add that when these centers were founded, it was during a time when Americans, we didn't have enough Americans to provide the information necessary or to work in government positions. And we also didn't have the internet, which provides a lot of information that previously was difficult to access. So we live in a different time period now. And I think our centers need to adapt, our universities need to adapt to that. The second solution is to require public universities to make the information in the university foundation subject to FOIA requests. There's no logical explanation for why these university foundations should be excluded. The information that goes there should be excluded from the public. And the third solution I'm going to present here is that universities should not include foreign government officials on advisory boards. That seems counterproductive, counterintuitive to support American interests. So I hope you will read the report. There's a lot of interesting information there, and I will hand the mic over to David again. Thank you.
And thank you so much. Lovely and wonderful. Now, we're going to go to the first of our speakers in strict alphabetical order by last name. Dr. Kramer, may I please ask if you would go now? Oh, and you're still muted.
Okay, now you can hear me, right? So thanks very much for including me on this panel. Let me begin by saying this is a fascinating and a meticulously researched report. I wrote a book, Ivory Towers on Sand, The Failure of Middle Eastern Studies 20 years ago, based on the 1990s, 80s, and 90s. This paper, I think, is an important update. And the overview of hard data about Middle East centers between 2000 and the present is really invaluable. Overall, the picture isn't pretty, but that is not a surprise. Because the recommendations have to do with funding, I want to say something about what the findings of this new study suggest to me. And to anticipate my own conclusion, the problem in Middle Eastern studies, including the centers, can't be fixed by more transparency or oversight of the funding because the problem is baked into the culture. Now, to begin, let's go back. The first thing to remember about Middle East centers and area studies centers more generally is that they were invented to be money machines. In the 1950s, the Soviets were pouring resources into contested world regions. And if we wanted to counter them, we had to get under the skins of people who spoke strange languages and professed strange religions and had strange customs. So we had to create experts. And that's what animated the Ford and the Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundations, and ultimately the US government. So from the get-go, the measure of success or failure of the centers was their ability to attract money. And to get that money, they had to check 3 boxes. First, they had to have a strong core faculty built on their own resources. Second, they had to grant PhDs in a range of disciplines. And third, they had to teach all the relevant languages. And if you could check these 3 boxes, you could manufacture experts with advanced degrees and you could get your handout. Not that it was steady. I mean, the financial history of Middle East centers is a story of boom and bust. Sometimes the reasons have been economic and other times political. When the Title VI federal money has flowed, the centers have prospered. When it's stopped, they've languished. And those who couldn't get enough US government funding often turned to the rich Middle Eastern governments. The first heyday of foreign funding came back in the 70s and the 80s when the price of oil skyrocketed. There was an oil embargo, and oil exporters worried over their portrayal as price gougers. So they funded Arab studies programs at Georgetown and at Harvard, even at Berkeley. It wasn't much compared to what they recycled to Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin, but it gave them an amen corner. And the message of these programs was basically this: it's the Arabs who've been the victims, so America owes them. Now, when I wrote Ivory Towers 20 plus years ago, US government and foreign funding had been through a couple of these boom and bust cycles, but they'd stabilized. And then came 9/11. At the time, I became a Mephisto when I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal warning the US government not to put another penny into Middle Eastern studies. But my piece had no effect on George W. Bush. Thanks to 9/11, he became the greatest patron Middle Eastern studies ever had. And as this report points out, and you have some charts there, government funding for Middle Eastern studies hit an all-time record during his administration. And this was accompanied by a wave of funding by Arab governments and individuals fronting for Arab governments. This time around, Arab states were alarmed by the charges that they turned a blind eye to extremists and terrorists. So they funded academics whose main assignment was to stigmatize any such suggestion as Islamophobia. Now we're in another phase, the result of 2 shifts in the 2010s. First, America, having rushed into the Middle East after 9/11, then left it in disappointment. And this unfolded simultaneous to the Great Recession and the 2013 budget sequestration. So as a result, the US government funding of area studies has tumbled. On Barack Obama's watch, Middle Eastern studies lost much of the Bush windfall. So the Title VI grants haven't kept up. This report has a chart that shows the size of the average annual grant to a Middle East center. It is now where it was, or lower than it was, in the year 2000. It's maybe $260,000 a year. Well, inflation over the same 2 decades has been close to 80%. The Title VI package then is worth about half of what it once bought for a Middle East center. So where does the difference come from? It doesn't come from Arab sources. This study doesn't show any big Arab gifts in the last decade, and for a reason. Arab governments found a better way to burnish their images. Instead of giving to academic Middle Eastern studies, they started to give to Washington think tanks. Now, as I showed in my book, in the 1980s, 1990s, the think tanks surpassed the universities as go-to sources of expertise for the media and the government. And by the 2000s, Arab governments had figured this out and started spreading their money there. I mean, they'd always had lobbyists and attorneys in Washington, but these had to register as foreign agents. It's much easier to establish a program in a think tank, a respected institution, has high visibility, enjoys the same tax status as a university, and has no requirement for disclosure. So I'm not going to list the names, but some think tanks might as well fly the flags of the United Arab Emirates or Qatar. So who makes up the shortfall in academia? The universities themselves, the Ivy League institutions, and the flagship public universities, which host nearly all of the centers, are flush with money. In the prestigious ones, the general endowments grew massively over the past 2 decades. From 2000 to 2020, Harvard's endowment has grown by 122%, Columbia's by 164%, Princeton's by 208%, Yale's by 209%, Penn's by 304%. At the same time, tuition and fees have skyrocketed. Over the last 20 years, at national private universities, they've grown by 134%, and at national public universities by 175% for the in-state students. When I wrote Ivory Towers, the privates on average charged $19,000. Now they charge more than $44,000. So what is $260,000 a year for any of these institutions? They can fund their own centers out of pocket change. In fact, in recent years, several Ivy League institutions have lost their Title VI funding for their Middle East centers, money that they had for 50 years. And they didn't bat an eye. And that includes one of your case studies, Harvard, as well as Princeton. Now, remember too that outside the centers and across America, Middle Eastern studies have never had significant external funding. These universities and colleges have maybe a handful of professors who teach about the Middle East. They're usually scattered among departments. In such places, Middle Eastern studies are funded primarily by tuition-paying students and their parents, and maybe by state legislatures. It's the professors from these lesser places who make up the bulk of the membership of MESA, the Middle East Studies Association. So in sum, today, the major source of funding for Middle Eastern studies and even Middle East centers isn't governments, US or foreign. And that brings me to my concluding insight. Many of you will have noticed that earlier this year, the members of MESA, Middle East Studies Association, passed a resolution endorsing the academic boycott of Israel. That proposal had been on the agenda for years and had never gotten across the finish line. This, despite the fact that MESA's members they had itched to condemn Israel in a public way. So what changed? Among other factors, the money factor. Some of the weightiest opponents of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, in MESA were the leaders of major Middle East centers. Some of them personally supported BDS, but they thought that if MESA endorsed it, it could endanger their Title VI funding. And as recently as 2015, in MESA's own deliberations, we have a record of them, these people argued against BDS when it came up for discussion. But today, US government funding is so negligible in relative terms that the money argument no longer holds much water. Even if US government funding were to disappear, it wouldn't matter as much as it did 10 or 20 years ago. So why sweat it? Just follow your prejudice and endorse BDS. If Middle East centers were really worried about their federal subsidies, they would have left MESA last March when the BDS resolution carried, and a few did, but most didn't. Of the 6 case studies in this report, 4 centers remain institutional members of the Middle East Studies Association. That's Harvard, Georgetown, Texas at Austin, and Duke through the North Carolina Consortium. Now, the Mesa resolution also shows an indifference to losing Arab money. Remember that the trend in the rich Arab states is to normalize relations with Israel. The Abraham Accords are the opposite of BDS. So the Masons are basically flipping the middle finger to the rich Arab normalizers who have no problem cooperating with Israeli universities. So I submit Mesa can afford to endorse BDS, partly because Arab governments have largely stopped funding Middle Eastern studies anyway. Their money is in the think tanks, which do support Arab state policies of peace and normalization. So the result is this Middle East studies paradox. It's a case of self-sustaining radicalization that not only doesn't depend on outside funding, but actually deepens in its absence. It's the general woke climate in the academy that nurtures the worst in Middle Eastern studies. And it's the internal resources of the universities and colleges that pay for nearly all of it. So while I'm impressed by the thoroughness of this report, I don't think we can know what effect its main recommendation would have were it implemented. So the 5 recommendations that Nita made, only one isn't about transparency, and it's this, and I quote it, the federal government should consider withdrawing financial support for national resource centers. Now, do we think that this would moderate Middle Eastern studies? Probably not. Do we think this would shut the centers down? Probably not. So just what would it do? My own view today is that there's no way to reform Middle Eastern studies by pulling the purse strings. And there's no need. The Mesa crowd are doing a perfectly good job destroying their credibility and relevance on their own. The way forward is to create alternatives. There's an alternative to Mesa. It's called ASMEA. And there should be alternatives to the existing Middle East centers. If there's political and financial capital out there for change, I think that that's where it should go. So I've said enough.
Thank you so much. This will be a great discussion period when we get to that. Until then, however, Professor Myers, may I ask if you would give your the next comment?
Certainly, and thank you very much for inviting me. And me too, great work on this. This has been, it was a pleasure to read. I appreciate it. I'm particularly pleased to be on a panel with Martin Kramer, who literally wrote the book on this 21 years ago. And I see this study in many ways as a bookend, as Martin implied too, to his earlier study for what it has done for the study of Middle East studies. I share Martin's pessimism in many ways about the future of Middle East studies, but I wanted to take a slightly different tact and respond more directly to some of Nitu's recommendations for future action, and put this into perspective a bit, because I'm still in the higher education reform business and have been for a long time. And I think those of us who do this for a living take necessarily an intergenerational view of things. You have to, because nothing's going to change rapidly, as Martin has said here and elsewhere, and others have as well. We're not going to see a rapid change for the better in many elements of academia. Whatever is done with the money, wherever the money comes from, is going to be a very rough ride ahead. And I want to mention a couple of things that struck me as I read Hijacked, which I commend to everyone. It's going to be, note too, it's a wonderful source of information on updated for Martin's book, but also, for example, on foreign funded chairs and the case studies themselves. I'm especially impressed, Nitu, with your reporting from the University of Arkansas and George Mason. It's nice to get on campus and talk to people and interview like a reporter, and you did that, and it comes across, it gives it a vibrancy that it might lack had it been just an armchair study alone. Particularly though, I was struck by the historical introduction of this document, in which Nitu describes the 1958 founding of the National Defense Education Act, which of course later became the Higher Education Act, through which Title VI institutes are funded. And the most striking element of that is a contrast between this older understanding of America as a sovereign nation at that time, compared to what we see now among academics and certain elements of the federal bureaucracy, which no longer accept that. That is to say, they shared a worldview in which America's legitimacy as a state as a nation and Western civilization's legitimacy, having just come through World War II not too long before that, wasn't questioned by many of the leaders, at least, that we're discussing here in these Middle East Studies Centers, in academia in general, among the public and public intellectuals, thought leaders, donors, and others didn't really call into question at that point the legitimacy of the entire operation. But we no longer share that. If you look at the problems that you encounter and that you have outlined, Nitu, and a lot of us have written about over the years within Middle East studies, you mentioned, for example, the tendency, the urgency to bridge cultures. You mentioned the Bridge Institute too at Georgetown, which is Saudi funded ultimately. There's another problem, but it symbolizes this in many ways. These exist not to study the peculiarities, the uniqueness of various Middle East cultures, of Islam itself and its manifestations, of history, but instead to play down, deny, and if possible, simply end the conversation about the differences that separate us from these various regions. That wasn't the case 60 years ago, 65 years ago, when this program was new, and when the Middle East Studies programs, as you noted, were nascent and underfunded, and there weren't enough people studying languages and history of the region at that point, which is no longer the case. So you no longer have the luxury of a federal apparatus, in this case for us today, the Department of Education, which administers these grants, to take an adversarial role toward the Middle East Studies Centers that it funds. And I certainly take Martin's point that this is a lot of times a drop in the bucket of these fundings, of the total budgets of these various Middle East Studies Centers. I'm still in favor of cutting that out, not because it's going to close them, but because it's a symbolic snipping of ties between the public, the taxpayer, the federal government, and these centers. I don't think that will be easy, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But what we find now is, instead of a situation in the 60s, 70s, 80s, perhaps, in which bureaucrats at the Department of Education might be prone, at least at times, to take a more critical look at the performance of Middle East Studies Centers that they fund. Today, it's almost as if the prosecutor and the DA and the defense attorney are all sort of ganged up against the defendant being the taxpayer or the scholar who wants to write and research rigorously based on reason and a rational approach to the topic at hand. Instead, you've got a state apparatus that works hand in glove with the Middle East Studies Centers themselves. And so the entire reason for funding them, as seen by the people in Washington, no longer exists as it did. It's no surprise, in other words, that they don't represent American interests abroad, because so many of them don't accept the legitimacy of America itself or Western civilization itself. At least that's their spiel, and I think a lot of them believe it, and I tend to take these people at their words. I want to address your recommendations too, and as Martin did, and jump to the end, recommending to everyone that they read through the entire report, because, as I say, it's a font of information, updated information on the status of the field. As far as outlawing them goes, ending their funding goes. Outlawing wouldn't be a bad idea either, but as far as ending their funding goes, drop in the bucket though it may be, if it's attempted, it's a pretty easy recommendation, a pretty easy prediction that all hell is going to break loose, both among the recipients of that money, as well as with the higher education lobby in Washington, the American Council on Education, the National Education Association, because of the, as you outlined so well, Nitu, and as others have written about, the K through 12 curricula that is produced as a result of being a recipient of Title VI funds. For those who don't know, Middle East Studies Centers and other centers that receive Title VI funds must produce an outreach program that the Department of Education ostensibly monitors, and a large part of that involves the production of K through 12 curricula. And in fact, that may be the most damaging thing going. If federal money for that can end, I don't know how many of those universities will continue with that. My understanding is that Harvard, the richest university in the world, did continue with it once they simply decided to stop accepting these funds. But it's I think it's up in the air as to whether or not even wealthy universities will want to bother with that. And that would be a feather in our cap. There's on our side of this argument, if in fact K through 12 curricula could be at least removed from the hands of some of these professors. To get an idea of the kind of reaction that's going to occur, though, think back long ago to 2019, and Nitu mentioned this earlier, when the Betsy DeVos Education Department launched an investigation of the Duke UNC Consortium over their misuse of Title VI funds. The higher education press, the elite press, went into a state of unmitigated hysteria over this. There were those who announced the end of higher education as we know it, the end of the First Amendment. We were all going to be in shackles before long because of this one investigation going on at these two universities. You can imagine what would happen if a president, it would have to come from the executive office, proposed cutting funding for all of these centers, including centers, by the way, for Western Europe, Africa, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia. There are many other centers besides just Middle East studies. That's unlikely, I think, to happen anytime in the near future. It's certainly not going to happen under the current administration. I remind you, too, there were 19 investigations launched from June 2019 until the Biden administration came into office, investigations of Title VI centers for the misuse of these funds, of Title VI funds. If you've paid attention to the higher education press in the last couple of days, the Chronicle of Higher Education has reported that those are all about to be closed, it seems, which is not a surprise at all again either. The higher education lobby is extremely well financed. And I think in cases like this, again, because of the use of federal funds to create these K through 12 curricula, which Nitu has shown to be toxic and highly politicized, very damaging, critical race theory, the whole baggage of the woke movement are placed into these for brainwashing of children, of kids throughout the country. We can expect the National Education Association to be involved as well. And that is the teachers union, which exists, of course, to protect teachers and administrators. It has very little to do with student well-being or learning. And I suspect they would attempt to motivate their members to rise up against something like this too. So even a change like that, even if Martin is correct, I think he is, that it would not make a lot of difference for the actual funding of these institutions. Even that is going to be extremely difficult to do. I think your FOIA, your idea of making these foundations connected to universities that are used to essentially launder money from foreign entities, FOIAble, and your efforts for better transparency in foreign funding of universities, and including, of course, the NAS has led the way in exposing the Confucius Institutes. This goes beyond Middle East studies in this, billions and billions of dollars every year. Those seem to me to be something that is more doable. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to cut the federal funding for Title VI, we should, but I think we can expect, this is probably going to be viewed as a hill to die on by many of our opponents in the higher education blob, in the higher education lobby. I'll close my comments by noting something that something that Martin has noted over the years, and that Nitu, you write about too, which is the devolution of many of these centers into de facto ethnic studies centers. This has occurred over years, and about mid-September, many of you may have noted that the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania lost its Title VI grant. It was surprising. They blamed the university for not funding the center fully enough to warrant additional federal support. And so it lost its grant. I was surprised by that, pleased, but surprised. The reaction on campus, though, at least that I have been able to find out about, hasn't centered around the loss of the opportunity to learn, the loss of the opportunity to, again, as Nitu points out so often, to pursue truth, which is the true mission of higher education, or should be in academia. Instead, what we found was a reaction among students lamenting the loss of what amounted to Arab studies in their view. the Muslim Student Association, which is an overtly Islamist organization, the Latinx, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, coalition, the Asian Pacific Student Coalition, the Penn Arab Student Society, all of them launched protests against this, saying that it was, in fact, a blow to minority rights on campus. It took away their space. It took away their ability to be better understood by the broader student body. That is to say, it was an on-campus identity politics crisis in their view. It had very little to do with learning. It had very little to do, as best I could tell, with the classroom per se, much less with scholarship and teaching. It was instead another opportunity to parade the victimization industry in a setting in which, of course, victimology is tantamount to sainthood, essentially. So I think that gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of reaction you could expect with trying to reform this at all in just a practical way that's more immediate, perhaps, than waiting for everyone in academia to die off, which we won't be around to see if you're my age anyway. So again, thank you for this opportunity to speak. Thank you for writing this study. It's a gold mine of information, and I will end my comments there.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Now, I'm going to encourage at once everybody who is watching this, please put in your questions and comments, or questions, I suppose, above all, into either the questions or Q&A button. I'm actually going to start with a question of my own. In the meantime, what about zeroing out state funding of the public universities in particular? I guess, one, is that doable? Two, would it have a significant effect? And I suppose the answer to my three is, is that politically even more of a firestorm? I think the answer to that would be obviously based on what you were saying about federal funding. But is it a reasonable tactic to go after state funding of public university Middle East centers? For any and all.
I can try to present one viewpoint here. I think there are two ways of looking at the state funding issue. On one hand, we could condition state funds to whether the centers are not just the centers, just in general, the universities are teaching the materials in an objective way. That is one way to look at it, that we condition state funds based on that. And if the universities want to continue to teach it in the way that they want, then we can pull the funds. Another way to look at it, though, and this is more of a recent thought I've had, is when we take state funds away, the public doesn't have a stake in what happens at the institutions. And so is it better to focus more on making structural changes, and instead of just saying let's pull state funds, like we also want to make sure that we're going after for example, DEI statements, things that are devaluing education as a whole. I guess those are my two thoughts on this, and I present that interested to hear other ideas on this.
Dr. Kramer?
Well, most states don't have a specific program for funding area studies or Middle East centers. The funding for them comes out of the general pool of university resources. The state funding in general by state legislatures for public universities has been on a steady decline for many years now. The proportion that has to be made, and it's reflected in the fact that the largest increases in tuition across the board are for in-state students in state universities. So there's already this huge deficit. I don't see that it has had any impact whatsoever in limiting the effects of radical woke ideology on state campuses. They seem to be going down the same path as all the other institutions. I do think that there is one lever that state legislatures do have vis-a-vis these programs, and I'll come back to it again later. I think that one of the best issues, most effective issues that can be used is the boycott issue, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions issue. Some states have legislation on the books which outlaw boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I think that a close look at universities to see which parts of those universities are either engaged in or implicit with BDS movement, could lead higher administrators to take a hard look at what's going on their campuses, and perhaps here and there to rein in excesses. It's one thing to sort of spout off about in a general way, but it's another thing to actively boycott, say, Israeli academe or Israelis, or intimidate Jewish students with the threat of sort of secondary boycott of them. And I think that's probably a good way in which state legislatures can have some leverage. But as I say, there's no specific programs that fund this, so there's nothing to cut off. What you have to do basically is convince administration at the higher levels to use their own leverage when it comes to resources, when it comes to appointments, and other things. And I think that the issue on which they can best do this is not some generalized culture war, but the specific boycott issue.
Thank you. Professor Myers?
Living in Georgia, as I do now, I was mentioning this to my colleagues before we got on the air. I think it's possible in red states in particular to leverage some, I don't know if it's enough or not, but at least some pressure against administrators of universities via the governor's office, if there is a Republican or a governor who is so inclined to do this, a lot of ifs in this, and certain state legislators, chairman of finance committee or university higher education committees, and this kind of thing. It's possible, I think, to target them with information about either a center or, let's say, because as Martin says, not every public university has a dedicated center to Middle East studies or to any other kind of studies necessarily. It's possible to leverage some of that against radicalism on campus, and that's been done before to varying degrees of effectiveness. I think it's possible to do that when budget time rolls around. It's perhaps an opportune time is now, given the budget crunch that we're all entering here with inflation and possible revenues falling. Some state universities are more dependent on the state legislature than others, but in all of them, for the reason that Martin says, the percentage of their budget that comes directly from the state has decreased. That has necessitated an increase in tuition. And I think that gives another tool to use, if you will, to demand reform. If I'm paid $2,500 a year to go to, or a little more than that, Georgia, 40 years ago, I have no idea what it is now. It's many times more than that, surely. That's all the more reason to, because tuition has outpaced inflation many times over at virtually all institutions, is another reason to demand better bang for the buck, if you will. Now, part of that comes at about two, and I think we have to be careful about this, from a hostility to the humanities, given to what the humanities and social sciences have become during my lifetime, for example, at a university level. They have written themselves into oblivion in many ways by becoming so radicalized, so marginalized in what they do and teach that smart people are eventually turned off by this, I think. And so they've abandoned it. They've gone to business schools, they've gone to other majors, history majors, English majors, all of the old reliable majors that used to make up 10, 15% of the undergraduate student body, even more in some places, have now dropped to single digits. And so in that sense, they're already squeezing themselves out of existence, threatening them with budgets. Again, in a state legislature, this assumes a legislature and a governor that are open to this kind of pressure, even a grassroots campaign, perhaps of some sort, to do this among alumni, trustees, or organizations, of course, that attempt to appeal to trustees, ACTA and others that attempt to do this, to squeeze them some. I don't know how effective they've been. The radicalization continues apace. I think a lot of people also don't know what goes on in their state universities exactly. They don't pay much attention to it. Particularly, it's been commented on 1,000 times, conservatives get along with their lives. They don't tend to be activists. They don't tend to be out in the streets marching. They're more worried about making money and for their family and doing things in their communities. So I just throw that out as a possibility. It is, I think it's possible. I think it's difficult, but I don't think it's impossible.
Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you. I am going to go to the questions which have been appearing from Jack Summer. how many Middle East studies centers are there in United States higher education, whether or not they are NRCs? And why not include, therefore, major university centers like University of Chicago and Princeton or Portland State University? I guess, Neetu, to you first.
Yeah, so there are over 50 Middle East or Islamic Studies centers in the country. And to address the second question of why not include University of Chicago or Princeton, I think these decisions were basically made. We wanted to have a mix of public and private universities that or centers that receive a lot of attention, such as those at Harvard and Georgetown. But I also wanted to include centers that don't receive as much of attention, such as the University of Arkansas, which there is a goldmine of information there. And I think part of the reason University of Arkansas did not get so much coverage is partially because it's a little bit difficult to get to. Even by plane, it's not the easiest place to go, but I'm so glad I was able to go there and see what was happening on the grounds. But there's only so much we could do. So these centers, there was a lot of thought into the kind of centers that we would choose. And of course, if there is unlimited time and unlimited resources, would have looked into Princeton, University of Chicago. There are also important centers there too.
Thank you. Do either of the other professors have anything to add to that?
Well, of course, as you said, if you'd had more time, you could have added more. For long, it was the aspiration of every Middle East center to become a national resource center, and it's not an easy process either. The amount of paperwork that you have to do, the amount of resources of your own that you have to invest is considerable. You have to invest, as I said, in a core faculty. You have to do that on your own. You have to invest in library resources. That's another criterion. That also is expensive. So it's always been a rather small club of institutions which have enough of the resources and enough of the attributes to actually compete for these. I think it's interesting that in a chart that you bring, the number of national resource centers has declined. It went up after 9/11 when there was a push to put out more people who knew Arabic. And then it's come back down. So in a way, that in itself is a kind of contraction of the Title VI program. Another contraction, of course, as I mentioned, is the inflation itself. The actual figures have not gone up. So you wonder to yourself, if you're in one of these centers, I mean, how many man hours do I have to spend on preparing these proposals if I'm only getting half of what I got, 10 or 20 years ago? I think it's very significant that Harvard and Penn were not renewed, and Harvard and Princeton were not renewed, and now Wynn tells me that Penn also was not removed. I think there is an understanding in the Department of Education, here I'm guessing and speculating, that given the huge amount of attention that the media have provided recently over the size of the endowments, the tax-free growth of these endowments of these richer institutions, they now have to cross a higher bar. And it may not be worth it for them to do that. So the smaller number of centers that we have actually are not in institutions which are quite as prestigious as they were before. What I would say then overall is that we have a contraction of the system, so they're more relative to the number of Middle East centers that there are. The national resource centers are even fewer.
Let me ask a question real quickly, just if anyone knows. Beyond Middle East Studies Centers, does anyone know whether or not the number of Title VI centers across the board has declined or increased over the past several years, including Russian studies, African studies, Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and so on? I don't know off the top of my head. It'd be easier to find out.
I'm not sure either. Yeah. My main focus is Middle East studies. So
sure,
I'm
all of us.
Of course, I'm aware of individual events happening at some of these centers, but I did not look into that.
I wonder if the trend that Martin outlines is common across disciplines, in other words, but anyway, we'll find out later.
That will be the next report. Actually, look, thank you. That's a good question to have, and it is good information that we should know. And anybody who's listening to this, if you want to research this and find it out and tell us the information, we'd be glad to know. So this is the task for everybody who's listening. I'm going to go to a question from Lev Citrin. It is very easy to debunk Islamist ideology that underpins Iran's regime or ISIS and such like. Yet academics and the mainstream press adamantly refuse to attack Islamism head-on its lack of intellectual merit. Why so? To any and all.
Well, academics tend to be in the apology business when it comes to these subjects. Their first reaction will always be that Islamism has nothing to do with Islam. Certainly terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. To suggest that is Islamophobic. And that the academics, have some vision of what true Islam really is, and it's a religion of peace. This is, this is the widespread prejudice, one might say, within the academy. I think it partly reflects the fact that many of them are themselves Muslims, and for themselves, they're dealing and struggling with some of these issues in a personal way, and they project this onto a wider canvas. One of the reasons that the think tanks did become more prominent in the American eye was the fact that people in the think tanks and people in journalism were prepared to deal with some of these questions head on. On 9/11's last anniversary, which was the 20th, not the last one, but the previous one, there were a lot of documentaries and films and interview programs going back and looking at the 20 years since 9/11. And I did sort of a quick check and saw how many of those interviewed 20 years later were academics as opposed to journalists, military people, and think tankers. Academics really weren't there because they refused to address questions like ISIS, questions like Al-Qaeda, Islamic terrorism in a straightforward way, and trying to relate them in some way or another to the wider culture from which they emerged. So, have no doubt, the academics pay a price for their refusal to take on these issues, and the price is that they're growing irrelevance in the public domain.
Yeah, and that's part of the go ahead.
Go ahead, you go ahead.
Just quickly, as part of the intellectual homogeneity of academia that Martin is discussing, it's those who would like to speak out are very often afraid to do so. It's now been not quite 30 years, 20-something, 25 years, since I worked on a college guide, and we talked to hundreds of professors. And this was in the late 90s, so not as perhaps as politicized as it is now. Already, the majority of them were afraid to speak to me from their offices. I spoke to most of them by telephone from their homes because they were afraid someone would overhear them through the door, through the wall, and when they critique their own institutions, but when they critique academia overall. And since then, surely the intellectual homogeneity, meaning the radicalization, the wokeness of academia has gotten worse, substantially worse. It seems to get worse every year to me, across the board in the humanities and social sciences, and now increasingly in the sciences. So the problems of Middle East studies borrow from and are part of the overall intellectual malaise of academia. And those who would speak out are probably want to keep their heads on their shoulders, not be ostracized, get a raise, not get all the worst teaching times and everything else. And so they tend to stay quiet, or they abscond to a think tank.
Thank you. Anita, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I think this question reflects exactly what the problem is in academia overall, and particularly with these centers, which is that they focus more on presenting positive perceptions rather than just telling us how it is and telling us that, and showing us the truth. The truth is not concerned about whether it's a positive or negative perception. It's just concerned about the facts. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, whether in the media or in academia, we're not getting the full story here.
Thank you. I actually want to follow up with the question is also about the press. And I guess, what is wrong with the press? I mean, I suppose independent of the journalists come out of the schools and therefore have been perhaps somewhat brainwashed themselves. But what are there other factors in journalism we should be thinking about, and what is needed actually to get proper journalists, knowledgeable about the Middle East, and first to educate them, and then to get them an ability to be a venue in the press in the United States. This is wandering a little bit, but still, the question was about the press, and I wanted to follow up on that.
But advise any reader to search out his sources very carefully. There is good information about, but if you rely on the old legacy media and that alone, I mean, many people do that. None of us do it, so it seems strange. But in fact, tens of millions of people sit down every night and still watch CBS News the way my father did in the 1950s or 60s or something. And it's where they get as much as they get information on anything. That's where they receive it, or on social media, or in as much as they want to be educated on this at all. But there are sources out there. Martin mentions the think tanks. That's, to me, for obvious reasons, the obvious place to go. As far as training journalists, that's another matter, because getting them hired, you have to find an outlet for your writing, and you have to be able to be paid for your writing. And I think all of us who have written here and there for online publications know very well that they either pay nothing at all, or $50 or $100 here and there. It's kind of hard to pay the rent with that. So that's a real problem. The decline of the press, the politicization of the press, is a very serious problem for this country and for the West in general, I think.
I have a distinction that I make between sort of working journalists and a number of journalists who've managed to break out and themselves write books. They have the time and the leisure and the relationship with the publisher to write books. I think some of the best things we saw over the past 20 years by way of book-length treatments of bin Laden, of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, were actually the work of journalists. They saw there was a story here. The publishers recognized the story. There's a lot of drama in it. They went out, they saw with their own eyes. They weren't just pontificating from a comfortable office like this one, and they produced some really important work. And when I was running a book prize, many of those prizes actually went to journalists, not to academics. So one of the things that one must lament in mainstream journalism is the disappearance of the foreign correspondent. It used to be that newspapers used to keep people on a permanent basis in various places in the Middle East. They can't afford to do it anymore, or they don't want to do it anymore. And so the number of journalists who actually have real area expertise is on a constant decline. And I think that's unfortunate. There used to be even Middle East correspondents, people who specialized in the Middle East. You almost never see it today. Would be good if we had them again, but the economic realities are what define that.
Thank you. Sorry, and Neetu, did you speak on this already, or?
No, I pretty much agree with what Wynn and Martin have both said. Again, I think I see many similarities between the media and academia, and probably for good reason. So I do think a lot of this is ideological. There's a commitment to presenting individual stories, lived experiences, the phrase of lived experience. And I think in some ways it's also viewed as an oppressor versus oppressed. So the West or Israel is viewed as the oppressor. And so if the media reports on these issues from a perspective that's either more positive towards the West or acknowledges maybe some shortcomings even on the other side that's considered more oppressed, then it's like they are conceding that they are on the side of, quote, the oppressor. So I think that might be part of the reason why the media coverage is the way it is.
Thank you. I am going to go to a question from Daniel Pipes. An honor to have you attending, sir. How much are students affected by the bias of their Middle East studies professors?
I'd like to take this question because I actually documented it in the report. I actually had instances to talk to some students and to get their perspectives on what they were learning at the centers. And at Georgetown, for example, there was one person who was more familiar with the centers and what they were teaching, and I casually brought up, do they teach about terrorism? And This person said, no, we don't even use that word. It's more about culture. And I thought that omission was kind of surprising. So in some ways there's some bias there. They're just not receiving information related to national security. At another university, I spoke with a student who was already had some negative perceptions of America, and that's partially because this person had a Palestinian background and had told me that a lot of the discussions on foreign policy were, quote, lies. And this person basically believed that socialism was a better system and capitalism was terrible. So these were already some preconceptions this person had, and the courses never tried to correct for it, or it actually made those sentiments stronger. So I do think that there's, based on talking to just these students and what I've seen at the center's posters, what they promote, I do think that there is quite a bit of bias, and it's reflected just through these answers that the students gave me.
Thank you. Dr. Kramer, Dr. Myers?
I think this is the crux of the issue. I think most of the academics practicing Middle Eastern studies are not particularly significant in the public domain anymore. They had their 15 minutes after 9/11 and they wasted them. And many of them have sunk back into obscurity. I won't name names. You probably wouldn't even recognize the names anymore. But young people continue to sit at their feet. Their parents pay good tuition for them to do so. And I think that what they encounter there is nothing short of indoctrination. Now, the thing is, it's very difficult to isolate the contribution of Middle East Studies professors from the rest of the professorate, because the rest of them are doing the same thing. So it's embedded through intersectionality and other issues into a wider culture. It used to be, and I thought this after 9/11, that Middle Eastern Studies was almost a world unto itself. But the rest of academia is caught up to Middle Eastern Studies. And so it's now enveloped in an embrace of like-minded thinking, which just further reinforces the message coming from the professors. And I think here that's the serious problem. It's going to be harder and harder to take the measure of these students when they graduate, because many of them will have been thoroughly indoctrinated. Now, I did notice from my student days, and I see it encountering other students, that there is a rebellious streak in many students. They're not necessarily easily indoctrinated by their professors. There's always a minority that are, tough-minded, and just as they've brought a critical view to their parents, they bring a similar critical view to some of their professors, and it manifests itself in a search for other approaches. And that's why a student body will always be wider in its politics, in its preferences, than the faculty who are instructing them. So the job of those of us who say are in think tanks or in government who need to recruit young people is to find the virtuous few.
Yeah, I would add to that, and for the record, I never killed off my dissertation, unfortunately, so I got out before it killed me. But not only are these professors influencing students in the classrooms in the college, but remember the K through 12 requirements for these federally funded centers, and no doubt many other professors are producing these, because of course, if you write a successful textbook, you're pretty well home free. You can do what you want. You can make an enormous amount of money on this if you're a co-author of it. I know some people, I think probably most of us do, who have done just that, who can retire whenever they wish. But the authors of the curricula are influencing students from the single years forward, so that they're arriving on campus already predisposed to believe what a lot of these professors say. In Middle East Studies in particular, and Nitu has done an excellent job in going through and finding out many of these problems. Others have done the same kind of work for years and have discovered the same kind of thing, biases that are, and they're all in the report, we all know what they are. So you have that as well, a problem coming out of Middle East Studies Centers. So it's the students, once they get there, as Martin says, try to direct them toward those virtuous few, if you will, who can teach them and will teach them well. But you also have it in the National Education Association's Teachers Union, and there's hundreds of thousands, millions of members spread out across the country. It's the plural of anecdote is data, as we all know. So I would use this as an example. I know people I went to college with years ago who were pretty apolitical at that point. And by the time they're my age, I'm 62, they have become absolutely lockstep members of the NEA because they taught for 30 years, 35 years, they've retired now, but they have completely morphed into people you wouldn't have recognized in previous years. And think of what that does to their students as well. Just think of the students they have taught over these years. Education colleges are another problem. This is maybe beyond the scope of this, but doubtless there are professors in colleges of education and education departments, which you must go to in order to earn your accreditation, in order to be so-called qualified to teach in public education, who have also majored in Middle East studies, Arab studies, Islamic studies, or taken a lot of classes in them. And they teach tomorrow's teachers, and those same people go out and do the same thing in the classroom. So it's not only rancid in academe's rancidness spreads, it infects so many other elements of society.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question, possibly. Is there any way to have any sort of screen for application to the Foreign Service and similar directly federal government positions, which can somehow screen out radical activists and ideologues from service from service for the country? Or how should is this an undoable goal, or is there a doable goal to at least preserve the Foreign Service from also being corrupted by the Middle East Study Centers indirectly?
Well, I don't know how one would implement that. One thing we do have today that perhaps didn't exist in the past is that as these government agencies recruit, they now have access to social media postings of various candidates. There they sometimes really reveal their innermost biases, and these can be disqualifying. But it's a pretty opaque process, and I'm not so sure that that any outsider can have significant influence on it. And by the way, many of these procedures have been in existence for many decades, and usually recruitment reflects the bias of the recruiting institution. So if you don't change that, you're not going to change the nature of the people that you recruit. If I may, I wanted to go back to sort of core recommendation and raise sort of a flag, both for Nita and for Winfield, and it's based on sort of my own lived experience. 20 years ago, after my book, we had the idea that we should have a supervisory board for Title VI. And I spent a lot of time up on the Hill, meeting with congressional staffers and even a few congresspersons. We even found a champion or two for this. And we worked very hard at it. The Higher Education Act was up for reauthorization that year. And we wanted to get something in there which would send a strong message that this program should be accountable. We didn't call for cutting off the money, but we wanted to become accountable. And we ran into a very interesting reaction. I would call it rallying. The minute we targeted Title VI, and especially the Middle East centers, what we saw was circling of the wagons, an embrace of the Middle East centers, an embrace of the Middle East professors by, first of all, the ACE, the formal lobby in Washington, which saw this as the beginning of a slippery slope. But then the people from area study centers beyond the Middle East, and the great majority of them have nothing to do with the Middle East. Of course, maybe the Middle East is 10% of this program. They say, why are you, we'll rally around the Middle East crowd in an act of self-defense of our own programs. And then, of course, you could almost say that the Middle East studies crowd was enamored of our criticism because it allowed them to then go to the rest of the academy and say we're victims of McCarthyite witch hunt. We deserve your solidarity. And they got it. They were embraced. And not only that, but it gave them a greater claim on the internal resources of their universities, saying, you see, we're being persecuted. We need your support. So if you go in this direction, you have to be prepared for the rallying on the other side. And it actually, I think, has done a lot to strengthen Middle Eastern studies. My own view is that, you know, the steady erosion by inflation, the fewer centers, this has had, and of course it was mentioned now, the upcoming economic crisis is going to be, again, something like 2013, where you're going to have budget cuts across the board. It's enough to, if you put a big enough question mark by Middle Eastern studies, then at the end of the day, they'll just get less money. They might not be zero budgeted, but the sum total of it all will be less. The important thing, and I come back to this point that I made in the beginning, is that we have to think about alternatives. We've recently had the creation of an alternative university in Texas. Maybe that university should have a Middle East center. We have to start thinking about places within the realm of the, you know, American academia is very big. There may be 2,000 institutions of higher education, places where you could build alternatives rather than constantly beat our heads against the wall of trying to change something that's evolved from a sociological point of view over decades and has only been reinforced by the overall biases of the academy. Not only did we create an alternative Middle East Studies Association over in Israel, I created a kind of an alternative Middle East department and an alternative college, Shalem College. There has to be some kind of initiative here that does the same thing. Grow our own has to be what it comes down to. And that requires a lot of effort, but that's effort that isn't expended in the friction with the existing prejudices of the system we have today.
Yeah, let me second Martin on that. A few years ago, Warren Treadgold, a Byzantine historian, wrote a book called The University We Need, and he advocated precisely that. He said there are a lot of billionaires around, including some that lean to the right. Dig into your pockets, as John D. Rockefeller did, as Andrew Carnegie did 100 or more years ago, and create a new research university. In fact, he said to model it on Princeton. Martin, if you read that book, but he says model it on Princeton, located in Washington, D.C. I don't think I agree with all of his recommendations, but that kind of, that is possible. I mean, it's not impossible to found a major research university with the kind of money floating around in the pockets of some people. It won't start huge, but he said do it quickly while there are still enough old school professors around alive and able to work to draw them to it. And you see that in a small liberal arts way already, of course, going on with a variety of religious institutions, in particular Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, that stand apart from the crowd, but they're a drop in the bucket for all the hundreds of thousands of students that are out there. But it's got to start somewhere. So that's absolutely.
I also agree that when you want a proposition of just cutting off funds, that of course I don't expect the other side to simply accept that. And it's one of those things where I think at some point lawmakers, leaders need to take that seriously and just push through and just consider from a rational perspective, if the funding is cut off to these centers, is it such a big loss? I mean, we have the Department of Defense's Defense Language Institute, which takes care of a lot of language training from a national security perspective. And one thing that I found interesting about that particular institute was that it seems to be more effective in also language training, in that the trainees are they learn the languages in I think half a year to a year, which learning a foreign language is difficult, and the longer you wait, the harder it gets too. But I think something that they do well is they have these immersive experiences where students are isolated from the English speaking world and they are forced to learn the language that way. And I think that actually makes it more efficient. And to me, that seems to do, in many ways, that's doing the jobs that these national resource centers are supposed to do. So it seems like we have several centers, and then we have the Defense Language Institute that is essentially doing many of the expectations that national resource centers have. They also have cultural awareness so that people are aware of what they could run into if they're in a different country. So to me, it seems like there's just a repetition of sources, a repetition of centers and institutes, and we could streamline some things here. So I think we should expect pushback, but that doesn't necessarily mean defunding these centers is a bad thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am going to say we're getting near the end of our session time. I would like to ask you if the three of you could give a closing statement, and I guess perhaps in reverse order. Dr. Meyer, Professor Myers,
Tell me when.
Win, Martin, and Nitu. If we could have that in that order, just some final statements, and I'll just do like a closing little bit for NAS. Win first, if I might ask you then.
Sure, very briefly then. Again, thank you for Nitu for doing this massive amount of work. It's hard to sum up all of this. I think I would end by saying two things. Go forward with reform efforts. Look, it may be a drop in the ocean. You're not going to utterly reform Middle East studies or any unit of the university overnight. But at the very least, it draws attention to what they are doing. And that's not a small thing. I think that over the decades, I can tell you that a few years ago, people were resistant often to what we put out about higher education at the time, because it sounded so crazy. They thought we were the radicals, that we were the people on the extreme right, saying these terrible things about these wonderful, truth-loving people after the eternal verities. That's no longer the case. People understand that increasingly, and to the point now that many of them are even questioning the efficacy of higher education at all. I'm not advocating that, but still, we have made progress in this, even though the departments themselves have declined. The public itself is more aware, and I think is harder to fool by and large on this. The flip side of that, last word, is they're still coming out K through 12. They're still being brainwashed in elementary school, and they're still graduating and ready to believe what they are told when they get to college.
Thank you. Martin?
Well, I've expressed my skepticism about reform, but I'm an enthusiast for criticism. And this is something that Campus Watch has done. Daniel Pipes and Wynn have been champions of this approach. And I think it's made evident to many the shortfalls and the challenges that we face in Middle Eastern studies. And I'm glad that the National Association of Scholars has now entered the arena. It's another powerful voice for intellectual criticism of what's going on in this field. I would let others draw the conclusion about the dollars and where they should go. But in this war of ideas, I think that we all have to take the lead, and we have to be relentless about it. And no one can complain when they've entered the public arena and put forth an idea that there's any such thing as illegitimate criticism. Criticism is all legitimate. It's expressed in thoroughly documented and articulate ways. And I think this study is a step in that direction. I congratulate you again on it. And I'll do my share to promote it on social media and elsewhere. And I hope there'll be follow-up so that we can meet again at some point in time and revisit this once again. I think that we have around this table now around this Zoom table considerable body of expertise on this subject, which can't be matched anywhere else, and it's our responsibility to go forward with it.
Thank you so much. And finally, Nitu.
Thank you. And I appreciate everybody who has joined us today as an audience member, as a panelist, and David as our host. You are wonderful. I want to conclude by saying that I think a lot of progress has already been made. I think lawmakers are well aware of the bias of these centers, and that's reflected in the funding cuts that have occurred over the years. I'm hoping that through this report, viewers, everybody can see that there is corruption in these centers. They're not just idly sitting back. They're not just promoting, they're not just saying the same things that they were 20 years ago. It's gone to another level, especially in the outreach material for K through 12 students. And that is something that everybody should be concerned about. And so I actually I'm a little bit more optimistic in seeing some reforms and seeing some of these solutions come to fruition. But till then, I hope everybody reads the report. And if you have any questions or you want me to look into something, you can email me at Arnold, ARNOLD, @nas.org.
Thank you so much. So thank you all so much. So the concluding bits for this webinar. Thank you everybody again for showing up, the panelists, the audience in particular. I will even say we do it for you, and your questions have made this possible. So Hijacked, Takeover of the Middle East Studies Centers is available as a report. Please go to the NAS website. I believe the link was put into our chat. There will be follow-up emails, again, linking to the report. This is part of our larger work on foreign influence. We have worked on Confucius Institutes quite considerably. We have now done work on Qatar, on Middle East Study Centers. There is work on boycott, divestment, and sanctions coming up. We are generally concerned about making sure that American higher education serves the American national interest. And so this is just a general campaign we care about and will continue to work on. I will mention, sheer advertisement. If you are interested in this and aren't yet a member of National Association of Scholars, we encourage you to join. We have a number of other webinars, which are not just our research. We have stuff on the history of American innovation, the history of great American literature, other webinars on any subject under the sun. The point being, there's a whole lot of stuff you can come and watch. I will just finally end by saying, again, questions unanswered, send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. And finally, this will be up within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. I think that's all the business. Thank you, everyone.